Hey everybody, all right, we got to talk about auto insurance. So that's our next piece of information that we got to go over. That's the topic for Unit 3, just auto insurance that we're going to be talking about. Really, there's two pieces. One is the auto insurance policy, and then the second piece that we get into is auto insurance and society. Why did we decide that this is the way, that mandatory auto insurance is the best way to handle the problem of people potentially causing large dollar amounts of damages with their autos, right? For most people, this is your biggest source of liability potential, right? You could hurt somebody in an auto accident. We call them accidents. You didn't do it on purpose, but that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for the damage that you cause. So if ultimately a judge or a jury or your own insurance company decides that you are liable for this incident, we're going to want to make sure that you have a way to pay for that. And most people wouldn't be able to afford to pay for these things out of pocket. When you start to talk about bodily injury, hurting somebody else, medical payments in the healthcare system, healthcare is expensive in the U.S. I've mentioned it before. You know, you hurt somebody bad enough to make them go to the hospital, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars minimum in damage. And that's just not something that the average person could afford to pay for out of pocket if they were held responsible for that. So we see real quickly that auto insurance is a smart purchase to protect yourself. Set aside the fact that the state requires you to have it. Even if they didn't, it would still be wise for you to do that. Otherwise, it would be real easy to get hit with a liability judgment that you couldn't afford to pay. And that's financially ruinous, right? Remember, we talked about liability. There is no maximum amount. And if you can't pay it, they'll take payments for the rest of your life if necessary. So it's a big deal. We're talking about the biggest single source of liability that most individuals have. So that's the topic of our third unit, is auto insurance. First, we're going to talk about the policy. So I thought to get started, it would probably make sense to do what we did with the homeowner's policy. And I'm just going to give you an outline. Good news is here, we don't call them coverages, we call them parts. And there's only 4. So we got Part A, that's liability. We've got Part B, that's medical payments. A little tricky here. It's not medical payments to others. We're going to find out that this covers me primarily in my vehicle. It'll also cover passengers in my vehicle. So in that sense, I guess there could be some medical payments to others. But in general, this medical payments is coming to me, and that's unusual. We haven't talked about a coverage like that. Let's see here. I guess let me widen this out here in case you can't see it. All right. Let's try that. Okay, then Part C, that's uninsured motorist. So we've got 2 pieces to this, but we're going to lump them together. You have uninsured motorist, that covers me in case somebody hits me and they don't have liability. The way it's supposed to work is they hit me, they cause me damage, their liability pays. End of story. I don't get involved. What if they didn't carry auto insurance? Oh, but it's the law. Yep, it's the law. And about 15% of people, or 1 in 7, just doesn't carry auto insurance. So that means if somebody hits you, there's about a 1 in 7 chance that they don't have auto insurance. So they've caused you damage. What are you going to do? Well, if you have health insurance, your bodily injury will be paid for. If you have this next coverage, Part D, damage to your auto, if you had that coverage, then you wouldn't have to worry. But what if you didn't? What if you didn't buy the damage to your own coverage, to your auto? Sometimes people call that collision. And then we have another one called other than collision or comprehensive. I'll get to that. We're back in Part C. Uninsured motorist protects me in case somebody hits me. And primarily it's bodily injury that this is going to cover. So normally in most states, uninsured motorist doesn't cover damage to my vehicle that somebody else does. Most of the time, uninsured motorist is protecting me against bodily injury from somebody else. If I have health insurance, you're right. That isn't something I have to worry about as much, although I'd have a deductible to handle. Okay, so then we've got Part D, which is damage to your auto. There's 2 pieces here. We have collision and we have other than collision. And sometimes people will call that comprehensive. Collision is when we have, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get later into the unit, but collision is when we have impact with another vehicle or object. So that's collision. So I hit somebody and it's my fault, my car is damaged. that's where we're going to look to collision coverage to pay for that. That's optional. Maybe you have this, maybe you don't. Normally, if you've got collision, you'll also choose to buy other than collision, but they are two separate coverages. Other than collision is things that can physically damage my auto other than impact with an object, right? So hail damage, somebody steals my car, theft, a tree falls on it, something like that, that isn't impact with an object that causes a loss. And again, if your car's expensive, has a lot of value and you wouldn't be able to afford to replace it out of pocket, you're probably buying collision and other than collision to protect yourself from damage that you do to your car. Somebody else hits my car and damages it, I want that to be covered under their liability. Now, if they don't have insurance, yeah, I'm going to have to cover it under my collision. I'm not going to be real happy about that. But my insurance company will subrogate against them to try to get them to pay for the damage that they've caused. In the meantime, they'll front me that money, though, and I can make a collision claim if I want. Sometimes it's quicker sometimes to make a collision claim, right? So we have a car accident. It's somebody else's fault. I want their liability to pay for my damages to my vehicle that they have caused, but maybe that's taking too long. Well, then I can file a collision claim, get it paid through my insurance company, probably a little quicker, and then my insurance company will subrogate against their insurance company to collect, and I can leave it up to them. Sometimes that's the quickest way to get it handled. And that's an option that you have. Okay, recap. Biggest coverage, liability. That's the most important one. What if I hurt somebody else seriously? What if I completely destroy their vehicle? I probably can't pay for those losses out of pocket, so liability coverage is something that I want to have. Medical payments, we're going to find out, has a relatively low limit. And so this is paying me if I get hurt in an auto-related incident, but it's only going to pay me usually $1,000 is really common. Sometimes it's as high as $10,000. You can choose. Obviously, that affects your premium. But point being, if I get seriously hurt in an auto accident, medical payments is probably not going to completely cover my damages because the limits tend to be low. All right, what if somebody hits me, it's their fault, and they've caused me bodily injury, but they don't have insurance? I can buy insurance on my own, Part C, uninsured motorist. That's what that protects against. And then finally, Part D is damage to my auto. So I can protect my auto. What if it's my fault and I run into something? Well, yeah, I can't, I run into a telephone pole. There is nobody to sue. I can't claim it was somebody else's fault. I've got to pay for that. So I'm either paying for that out of pocket, or I have chosen to purchase collision coverage. And again, if your car has a lot of value, would be expensive to replace, you're probably buying collision other than collision. Where you're not buying collision or other than collision is when your vehicle isn't worth very much, right? A lot of cars out there might only cost a couple $1,000s to replace. So rather than me buying collision and other than collision insurance and paying a premium every 6 months, I might choose to save that premium and so I can eventually replace that vehicle when it does get destroyed, one way or the other. So that's the outline of the policy, 4 parts to remember, and then the damage to your auto has 2 subparts, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. Okay, let me get back to my slides here. So auto insurance. I got to move this so you can see the whole thing. Not that. I've got to move. This is fun. There. I'm feeling like that's a lot better. Now you should be able to see that. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about, well, what is it we got to get out of this chapter? We got to talk about who is an insured under the auto policy. We'll find out that, like we did in homeowners, it's bigger than just the person's name who's on the policy. We got to describe the liability coverage. We'll talk about medical payments, Part B, talk about uninsured motorists, Part C, and then we'll talk about damage to your auto, Part D. And then the whole reason we do this is just like in homeowners, I've got some sample problems that we can use to try to solve so that you have an idea of once you have a loss, this is how these policies are going to work to solve those situations. Okay, so let's talk about some of the definitions that show up in the auto policy. Remember, anything when you're reading the policy, anything that shows up in quotes, that means it has a special definition. And if you want to know what that term means, you got to go to that definitions page. Or a definition section of the policy. So your covered auto is the first one that we have to talk about. So what is your covered auto? Well, yeah, of course, it's any vehicle that's shown in the declarations. Now on that declarations page, you're probably going to specify a specific vehicle, and we do that with a VIN number, right? The VIN, the vehicle identification number, that is specific to your car. So we will identify right here, this is the vehicle that we're insuring. There's no question if a car is in an accident, which one is supposed to be covered. Well, the one on the declarations with the VIN number, that one is covered for sure. Also, we find out if you buy a new vehicle, new to you, a newly acquired auto, you automatically have coverage for at least 14 days. And then they want you to notify the insurer. Most of the time when you buy a car through a dealer, you're going to have to show proof of insurance before they'll let you take it off the lot. But there's plenty of other ways to buy a car, right? I mean, you could buy my car. I'm not a dealer. I'm not going to be checking any paperwork or doing anything there. So if you were to do that, that's great. How do we know whether or not you're insured? This says you are insured for at least 14 days because it's a newly acquired auto. And in fact, even if you don't have collision coverage, if you did on your prior vehicle and then you replaced it, then you'd automatically have collision coverage automatically for at least 14 days. But what if you didn't have collision? Well, when you newly acquire a vehicle, you actually have 4 days of collision coverage. So to cover you in the odd instance where you drive the car off the lot and instantly you get into an accident, the damage to your vehicle, if it's your fault, the only source of coverage there is damage to your auto, the collision coverage. You would have that for 4 days automatically, even if you didn't say anything to your insurance company. In general, you want to notify as soon as you can. But the truth is a newly acquired auto is automatically covered for a short period of time, and that's nice to know. If you have a trailer, here's where we're going to handle that is in your covered auto. If you remember from homeowners, trailers was one of those special limits of liability categories. So here is where we intend to cover the trailer piece. And then we're going to find out that a temporary substitute vehicle is also considered your covered auto. So maybe you borrowed a friend's car and ran an errand. Maybe your car's in the shop and they gave you a loaner vehicle. Those are temporary substitute vehicles that are included in your covered auto. Okay, so we already did this on a separate document there, so I typed it in the Word document. You've seen this already. Part A is liability. That's the most important part. Then we have medical payments. Limits tend to be low, and that's going to pay me and other passengers in my car if I get injured as a result of an auto accident. If it's somebody else's fault, I'm going to need their liability to pay for it, and that will give me higher limits, most likely, and I'll be okay. But if I get hurt in an accident that is my fault, that's a problem because the only coverage I'd have is Part B, and it tends to be $1,000 a person, sometimes as high as $10,000 a person. But if I'm badly hurt, that's not going to go very far. So that's the problem with Part B coverage is it's nice to have, but limits tend to be low. Part C, you're choosing limits here for uninsured motorist. Somebody else hits me and hurts me. I want their liability to pay. What if they don't have auto insurance? Well, then I guess it's my problem. And I can sue them, but if they don't have auto insurance, they're not going to be able to pay out of pocket, right? Anybody who has assets to protect is buying auto insurance. They're not going to leave those assets exposed by not having insurance to cover these things. So somebody hurts me, I want their liability to pay. They don't have insurance. I'm probably not going to be able to recover from them directly. So one option I have is to buy first-party insurance on my own to cover against that possibility. That's what uninsured motorist coverage is. And that's Part C. Part D, damage to your auto. And again, somebody hits my car and damages it. If it's their fault, I want their liability to pay. If I hit somebody and it's my fault and my car is damaged, my liability will pay for their damage, but my liability doesn't pay for my damage, right? You can't be liable to yourself. That doesn't make any sense. So that's why we have Part D coverage for your auto. So whether I hit somebody else and wreck my car, or if I hit a post, or drive a car, in a ditch and roll it over, that's going to be Part D, damage to my auto. So that's for things where I can't recover from somebody else, usually because it's my fault. And then Part E and Part F, I don't expect you to remember. We will go over these, but it's not important to me that you remember that E is duties after an accident or a loss, And then part F, there's just some miscellaneous provisions that I want to make sure that you know. So again, I want you to know A, B, C, and D and how those work. With E and F, we'll just handle those individually, and we'll talk about how those individually work. Okay, so let's get started with part A. Liability coverage. Usually when you talk liability, it's described as split limits. You'll have 3 different numbers, and it might look something like that. So let me pull up the document here so I can explain this a little bit. I got to move it again. Let's see. There. Okay, let's make sure you can see all this here. And then let me get back into the document. So split limits, I'll just get all the way down to a different page, and then I know I'm not giving myself any problems. Split limits of liability. So most of the time when you look at auto, you'll just get 3 numbers, and it'll look like this. It might look, this would be the minimum limit in Indiana. So 25, 50, 10. Okay, well, great. What is that? That says this. The 25, these are in thousands, and the 25 is 25,000 bodily injury per person. That's the limit. So no matter how many people you hurt, none of them will receive more than $25,000 for their injuries if 25, 50, 10 is what you've purchased. The 50 is a limit that's bodily injury per accident. And then the 10, that's the limit is going to be $10,000 for property damage liability. And I guess I should throw in the word liability here to make sure that we are all clear on what exactly these limits are applying to. Okay, so as soon as I set this up, you can see the basis for some problems, right? I can say, okay, well, here's your limit, here's what you bought. You hit another car that contained 3 people. Here's the distribution of injuries, and I can write whatever problem I want to get at the idea of, do you understand how these limits work? So 25, 50, 10, that's the minimum in Indiana. I will tell you that if you've bought minimum coverage, you are dramatically underinsured. And this is why, right? The most that we'll pay to anybody else that you hurt is $25,000. Well, if you hurt somebody badly enough in an accident and they have to take a life flight to the hospital, that $25,000 was used up in the helicopter. That's before we even get to the hospital, and you'll be on the hook personally for the rest. So that's a problem, as you can imagine. So yeah, it's the minimum limit. You're good according to the law. I think you're radically underinsured, and a lot of insurance companies won't even sell you minimum limits. There's a lot of insurance companies, if you walk in and you say, I don't want to buy any more than I have to, they'll say, okay, 2 things. Number 1, buying just the minimum keeps you underinsured. Number 2, buying that next layer is extremely inexpensive because high dollar accidents are rare. So you're not saving very much money by trying to lower those top layers of coverage, because those top layers can be had for very little. Remember when we were talking about the umbrella policy, right? You can get $1 million in coverage on top of your first 300,000, right? That's the key. You got to have 300,000 underlying. If you got that first 300,000, the next $1 million you can have for $100 a year. It's nothing. It's so cheap. So you're just it's hard to save money by carving out that top layer of liability coverage. So we're going to do an auto quote assignment, and hopefully that'll become a little bit more clear, and you actually get to price that out and you see exactly what I'm talking about. But that's the minimum in Indiana is 25, 50, 10. And most states, if they have a higher minimum, it's not much higher. There is no state that has a higher minimum than 50, 100, 25. So what is that? All right, so what is 50, 100, 25? Well, that's saying, okay, you got 50,000 per person, per accident, 100,000 in total per accident. So it doesn't matter how many people you hurt, we're not paying more than 100,000 in total. And then the 25 there would mean you'd have $25,000 in property damage liability. So these are split limits of liability. And I think that's interesting because I think it makes it hard to understand. I think there's a lot of people driving around with coverages and they have no idea what they've got. You don't have to write it as split limits. You could write it as single limits. And that just means, okay, you have 100,000 in coverage. You pick your coverage amount, got 100,000 in coverage. We don't care how many people. We don't care whether it's bodily injury or property damage. We're just going to cover you up to $100,000. That's a lot simpler and a lot easier to understand. And you can buy limits that way if you want. But normally, if you leave it up to other people to discuss, they'll talk about split limits. And it's not hard to understand, but it is an additional layer of complexity for the average person. So it's important to know. Now, here's a good question. Okay, so what does this actually look like? Well, now we're getting closer to what I would consider adequate layers of coverage, because you have 250,000 per person. That's going to be hard to exceed. Match that up with an umbrella. All of a sudden, you got 1.25 million in coverage. It's going to be really hard to get over that. And it's not terribly expensive to protect yourself. Once you have assets to protect in that range, this is a really cheap way to do it. So this example here, 250,000 per person, 500,000 per accident, and then 100,000 for property damage. These first two are bodily injury. This last one is property damage. So what does that mean? What is the most that could be paid out under this policy? The absolute most if you had the worst case scenario happen. Well, they will not pay more than 500,000 in bodily injury. They will not pay more than 100,000 in property damage. So in this example, 600,000 would be the most that they would pay. I hope that makes sense. If you want to know what's the most a split limit policy would possibly pay, you're adding these last two numbers, right? Because that's the most in bodily injury, that's the most in property damage. And it's possible that you could have an accident that would max those out. The idea is to cover yourself to a level where that's really not very likely at all. And it's much easier to do that with this type of coverage than it is with Indiana minimums, which is exactly 1/10 of this amount. So you can increase your coverage by a factor of 10, and it's not going to make the premiums 10 times more expensive. In fact, I bet it won't even double the premium. And to get to get coverage extended by a factor of 10, it's just not that expensive to get the higher layers of coverage. Okay, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up here on the next lecture. Thanks.